In the 1920s, a mysterious sleeping sickness struck New York. Some believed it was a manifestation of a concurrent flu epidemic, while others theorized it was related to polio. And while medical science has come a long way in the last 100 years, the cause of the sleeping sickness, or Encephalitis lethargica, remains unknown to this day. So, today we're going to take a look at the mysterious sleeping sickness that plagued New York in the 1920s. But before we get started, be sure to subscribe to the Weird History channel. After that, leave a comment and let us know what other medical mysteries you would like to hear about. Okay, whatever you do watching this video, don't fall asleep. In 1917, World War I was taking lives like the world had never seen. And as if that wasn't enough, two epidemics began tearing their way through the already shell-shocked world. The first, and far more deadly of the two, would become known as the Spanish flu of 1918, and it remains one of the worst pandemics in human history. We did a video on that, so give it a watch when you can. Before it had run its course, the Spanish flu would wipe out an estimated 50 million people and affect somewhere in the neighborhood of 500 million more. While this crisis understandably took precedence, it was accompanied by a lesser-known but far more perplexing virus, the sleeping sickness. Through the practice of a retrospective diagnosis, medical historians have identified possible outbreaks of Encephalitis lethargica going all the way back to at least 1580. However, the 20th century outbreak is believed to have originated in Romania in 1915. World War I disguised its true impact in Europe, but it became more noticeable in New York, and doctors scrambled to identify the disease. There was plenty of confusion, but no clear answers. Due to the varied presentations of Encephalitis lethargica, the overwhelming demands of World War I, and the appearance of other epidemics around the same time, many doctors treated individual cases of sleeping sickness without realizing they were dealing with a wholly new illness. In fact, it took the work of Austrian neurologist Constantin von Economo to fully isolate and categorize the disease. Economo was a wealthy aristocrat and something of a Renaissance man. To wit, he was the first Austrian man to hold the equivalent of a pilot's license, and he was trained as an engineer before he moved on to psychiatry. After doing exhausting research on the topic, Economo gave the disease its name based on what he determined to be its principal manifestation: lethargy and catatonia. In a series of monographs that are studied to this day, he argued his case on the nature of the disease from its categorization as encephalitis, which is an illness resulting from inflammation of the brain, to its varied pathologies. The sleeping sickness prompted, among other things, an examination of the nature of sleep and the difference between sleep and catatonia. However, there was a wide array of experiences reported, some of which were quite pleasant. Take, for example, an account by Eleanor Carey, who suffered from the illness in 1923. She wrote, "After 2 months of illness, I was in little pain. In fact, it was so heavenly just to be allowed to sleep. But these people around me seemed determined to prevent my being comfortable." According to Carey, even after she realized that she couldn't sleep forever and would eventually have to wake, she found it to be a physical impossibility. She wanted to awaken, but no matter how hard she tried, she just couldn't. Other victims reported dreams and vivid hallucinations. Doctors found that in many cases, it was possible to wake the patient, but only for a few moments before they succumbed to sleep again. During the course of the epidemic, most doctors kept and compared rigorous notes. This allowed them to examine a variety of case histories, although because of the wide range of symptoms, it was still difficult to derive clarity from them. However, one thing that did emerge from the collected observations was the highly unpredictable nature of the sleeping sickness. One case study detailed the symptoms of a woman who suffered from Encephalitis lethargica in 1917. She went to a clinic exhausted and then quickly slid further and further into a state of sleepiness. Her symptoms were also accompanied by a fever and paralysis of her right arm. All things being equal, the woman turned out to be relatively lucky, and her condition slowly improved. 2 months later, she was discharged from the hospital with no signs of fever or paralysis. Unfortunately, she passed away a month later due to pneumonia. Not everyone was lucky enough to stage even a partial recovery. One young boy was brought to a clinic on April 20th, already in a comatose state. Despite the doctor's best efforts, he passed away 8 days later. Cases of both types were common and terrifying. There was no reliable way to tell who might survive and who might not. During its acute phase, encephalitis lethargica caused somnolence, lethargy, paralysis, fever, and sometimes it ended the life of the patient altogether. Some patients, however, made a full recovery, and amazingly, it often happened without any treatment at all. While a quick recovery was, no doubt, a huge relief, it didn't mean the disease was necessarily finished with them. In fact, after recovering, many patients developed some form of Parkinson's disease, a progressive nervous disorder that often causes the loss of muscular control. Parkinson's can include a wide variety of symptoms, and one of the most extreme forms was often seen in survivors of the sleeping sickness, akinesia. Essentially, this means total body paralysis. Some of these patients remained in a paralytic coma for many years. Movie fans of a certain age might remember Leonard Lowe, a real person played by Robert De Niro in Penny Marshall's fact-based 1999 drama film Awakenings. Leonard was exactly this sort of patient. Frighteningly, it is possible for a patient to fall into a deep, akinetic coma at pretty much any point during a case of encephalitis lethargica. This uncertainty often came back to haunt people who thought they had completely survived the disease, only to develop a worsening case of Parkinson's years later that culminated in a coma. Since the cause of the disease was unknown, these comas were thought to be irreversible, and those who suffered them were largely forgotten, as long-term coma patients often are. However, as shown in the aforementioned Awakenings, when the renowned British neurologist Oliver Sacks began treating them with a drug called L-Dopa, some of them were able to interact with the world for the first time in 40 or more years. Overshadowed as it was by the Spanish flu and World War I, the sleeping sickness didn't really come to the public eye until Oliver Sacks wrote his groundbreaking story in Awakenings, a book that movingly detailed his interactions with patients who suffered from the disease. Sacks was responsible for the proliferation of L-Dopa, the medication that awakened many of these patients. And in the book, he described the challenges of bringing people from the 1920s into the 1960s. The book was a massive success and is still considered one of the best pieces of medical nonfiction ever written. A fictionalized version of Sacks himself was featured in the movie adaptation and was played by none less than Robin Williams. After it was released, Roger Ebert wrote, "What both the movie and the book convey is the immense courage of the patients and the profound experience of their doctors." Ebert believed the characters in the story, and through them, the audience, re-experienced what it means to be born, to open your eyes and discover to your astonishment that you are alive. Despite Oliver Sacks' groundbreaking work with L-Dopa, there remains no complete cure for encephalitis lethargica, as the medication often only provides temporary relief. It is perhaps unsurprising that there is no cure because scientists don't really understand what causes the sleeping sickness in the first place. During the outbreak, there were many different theories as to the cause. When the disease first appeared in England, doctors believed that it was a form of botulism. However, botulism is the result of detectable bacteria, and the bacteria simply was not present. Many other theories have been proposed, but at the end of the day, the truth is simply unknown. To this day, papers are still written advancing various new theories, but none have been proven or widely accepted. Because of all the uncertainty surrounding the illness, it is difficult to truly define when it began and ended. It is also difficult to identify whether there have been any new cases, although the conventional wisdom says that at least a few more cases have popped up. In 2015, a paper was published about a young boy who had contracted HIV. When he came to the hospital, he quickly developed symptoms similar to encephalitis lethargica, lethargy, mutism, and muscular weakness of the optic nerves. There are numerous other examples of similar cases, but cautious doctors are reluctant to label them as sleeping sickness. Adolf Hitler may be one of the most overdiagnosed and overanalyzed individuals in human history. Due to his morphine addiction, his illness-plagued youth, and his general status as the genocidal douche of World War II, modern doctors love to retroactively diagnose him with everything from borderline personality disorder to irritable bowel syndrome. While most of these assumptions are sensationalist and based on wild guesses, there has emerged something of a consensus that the German dictator could well have suffered from Parkinson's disease. If that's true, it is likely that he also suffered from sleeping sickness in his youth. Due to the relatively late onset of his Parkinson's disease and his age at the time of the epidemic, the sleeping sickness makes a great deal of sense as the source of his Parkinson's. A medical paper also makes the case based on his symptoms. According to the research, Hitler had a deviation of the eyes, only associated with post-encephalitic Parkinsonism. In addition, he had dystonic facial spasms, polylalia, and a sleep disorder. Phenomena more likely to be associated as post-encephalitic than idiopathic Parkinsonism. Again, it is always dicey to retroactively diagnose historical figures, due to both the lack of contemporaneous material and our own modern biases. And this is made doubly difficult in the case of someone like Woodrow Wilson, who had a battalion of health issues independent of whatever we may diagnose him with today. However, that, not surprisingly, hasn't stopped a number of modern doctors and pathologists from using historical sources and medical records to diagnose Wilson as a sufferer of encephalitis lethargica. Edwin Weinstein, one of Wilson's most prominent biographers, believes that a complicated series of medical disasters accounted for Wilson's famously altered behavior during the peace negotiations at the end of World War I. Weinstein believes that after a number of strokes throughout his life, Wilson contracted the flu, which left him vulnerable to the sleeping sickness. Regardless, Wilson didn't have long to live after the 1919 peace conference. He passed 5 years later in 1924. So what do you think? What do you think caused the sleeping sickness? Let us know in the comments below, and while you're at it, check out some of these other videos from our weird history.